All right, good morning, good morning. This morning will not be your average Christmas sermon, but there's a big hefty but there. But this lesson will be about a new birth. We're in the middle of Revelation chapter 21, and I thought that it was very appropriate that the way we end our New Testament, the way we end the story of the Bible as we have it put together, does not end with an ending, does not end with necessarily a resolution to the story. It ends with a new birth. And so John's vision here in Revelation chapter 21 is not the ending that we might expect, right? But it's a fresh beginning. He says, then I saw a new heaven and new earth, and there's a couple, what we call chapters, which all fit onto like 1 or 2 pages about this thing that is the ending. And it just strikes me that this is very similar, but in an opposite sort of way, corresponding to the way the Bible story, the way it began in Genesis. Right? The story of the Bible begins with a beginning in Genesis, right? In the beginning, right? And now, as the story of that storyline of the Bible comes to a close, not quite so logically now, the story of the Bible draws to a close with another beginning. And so this sin-ruined creation that shows up at the beginning of Genesis, we have this creation, and immediately sin ruins it, and it changes it somehow. That sin-ruined creation is now made new, it says here in chapter 21. It's made new in the sacrifice renewed creation of Revelation. And so the creation is now, through Christ's sacrifice, renewed. And that story, this story, the Bible story that has creation for its first word, has now creation or recreation for the final word. In other words, the end is where we start from of the Bible. And so I want us to think about what John is seeing here, back all the way up. Where is John? What is he doing? We're not 100% sure, because sometimes he's on earth and sometimes he's in heaven and he's seeing these things. But the idea is that the heavens are opened to John. He sees something that we are unable to see. And so what we are able to see through John's eyes and what we're able to hear through his ears is something that we have never seen or heard before. We see God's perfect rule in operation. We no longer see the sin that is cutting us off from God. Right? We see God's rule in operation. We see his own words. We see it in his own language. And so we see the gospel narratives of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and these apocalyptic visions that John the Revelator or John the Seer has. And we see Jesus. They have the same subject. They're talking about the same thing. They're talking about Jesus. And they use the word heaven in the same way. And so heaven, when we talk about it in the Gospels, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, heaven in the Gospels and in the Revelation here from John, and throughout all the Old Testament scripture for that matter, heaven is the metaphor that tells us that there is far more to what we're seeing than meets the eye, than we have the ability to perceive. And so what we see in their language, these writers' language and use of the word of heaven, is exactly that thing that we cannot see. And that is amazingly not far out there, But we see this thing that's right here in front of us, this thing that lives right in front of us. We see God, we see his rule, we see his love, we see his judgment, we see his salvation, we see his mercy, his grace, his healing, his wisdom. And I don't want to throw anybody off by calling the word heaven a metaphor. But just because I call it a metaphor does not make it any less real, right? It simply is recognizing that heaven really is inaccessible to us. We have to use the words that we know to describe that thing that we don't know. And even John, when he's sitting there in front of these things, can you imagine him trying to come up with words to describe these crazy things that are going on? I mentioned this in the Bible class, but the Hebrews and the Greeks both only had one word that does the work that English has two words for. That is the Shemayim in Hebrew and the Oranos in Greek. Both mean either the visible sky, the air where the birds are, but it also means the invisible realm where God is, where God is now invading us. He is now coming to us to be with us. And the only way you can tell the difference between which realm is being talked about is by the context of what's going on. But whichever version, whether it's the sky or whether it's heaven to us, whichever version is being talked about, the other is always whispering in the background because you only have one word for both of those. And so it's making its presence felt. Whether you're talking about the sky where the birds are, because you don't know how the birds fly. You've got to remember, you've got to look at this from a first century perspective here. We don't know how the birds fly. And so there's something unknown about that, just like there's something unknown about God's realm. And so this word heaven in the Bible is sort of doing double duty for the visible sky, but also the invisible. And it keeps our imagination at work. And I think this is intentional by God, that he wants us to dream about these things, to look forward to the benefit that he has waiting for us. These words keep our imaginations alive by making connections between what we see and what we do not see. And just because we don't see something does not mean it is not real. Right? And so, in the closing chapters of Isaiah, chapter 66, it's the first time we get this sort of language that we're going to hear about today. God is going to make a promise to Isaiah. And what's the bigger picture here of Isaiah? When was Isaiah written? Right as they're going, or right before they go into captivity. In chapter 65, he mentions in verse 17, "For I will create a new heaven and a new earth, and the past events will not be remembered or come to mind. Then be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating." The past events that he's talking about there are the captivity, are the slavery of Babylon, but also maybe the slavery of Egypt, and also maybe the slavery of their own leadership, right? And be glad and rejoice forever in what I'm creating, for I will create Jerusalem to be a joy, and its people to be a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. The sound of weeping and crying will no longer be heard in her. If we jump over to chapter 66, verse 17. might have written that wrong. Yep, I wrote that wrong. Give me 1 second. Oh, verse 22 in chapter 66. For just as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make will remain before me, this is the Lord's declaration, so your offspring and your name will remain, and all of mankind will come to worship me. From one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, says Yahweh, says the Lord. This promise that's made to Isaiah of this creation of the new heavens and the new earth, he says it's a promise that's going to endure forever. And the fulfillment of that promise begins now. And it begins in John's vision of the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven to take its place here on this renewed earth, or this refined earth. And so the two words heaven and earth, I mentioned this in Bible class, the two words heaven and earth, they tie together our material creation, what we see around us, they tie it to the eternal and the unseen. And so we're immersed in this material creation from the very beginning. From the first page of the Bible, we have this material creation, right? All the way to the end of the story now. In Revelation, we have the material creation, this new heavens and new earth. And between those two books, Genesis and Revelation, nothing takes place outside of this material creation. Our existence is framed by physical matter. That's all we know. There's a very few times when somebody like John gets to peek beyond the veil, as the saying goes. And so things that are unseen can only be comprehended. We can only understand the things that we don't see by means of things that we do see. We can only use words that are in our backpack, the things that we have experienced in our life. And so the gospel, the good news that Christ came, is the enemy of Gnosticism. That sounds like I'm getting on a rabbit trail, but believe me, I'm going to bring it back around. Gnosticism is the belief in this secret transcendental, there we go, knowledge, a secret knowledge. And if you have this knowledge, you will transcend into something better, something other spiritual being. You will leave the physical behind. That is what Gnosticism was all about. And so the enemy of that is the gospel message of Jesus. The gospel message does not begin with Jesus as matter, who then gradually gets refined via special knowledge into spirit. God did not begin with a material universe, with flesh and blood Jesus, and then gradually change it into spirit. That's not what happened. And so let's think about what has happened up to this point in chapter 21 before we jump in. There's three key themes that John has introduced earlier in the book that are now being replayed from chapter 17 through 22. And those three themes are this. The fall of Babylon is number one. Number two is the final defeat of evil. I won't even call it a battle. That's how it's portrayed. But there is no battlefield and people dying and those sorts of things. There's only the resolution to the battle. So we have the fall of Babylon, the defeat of evil, and the arrival of the New Jerusalem. And so in each one of these last major sections here, they're exploring the coming of God's kingdom from a different angle. So each one of these portrays the same thing, just from a different angle. First is this vision in chapter 17 through 19 of this beautiful woman dressed like a queen, but who is covered in the blood of the martyrs, it says. She's riding a dragon beast, right? And this is the same beast that we see from earlier in the signs visions. So we have, first is the seals, then we have the signs, or halfway in between the signs and the trumpets, and then we have the bowls. So there's almost 4, but really there's 3 sets of symbols. So she's riding this dragon from an earlier vision, dragon beast, and that is a symbol that would not have been mistaken in the first century. This is a symbol of the rebellious nations that she controls. I mean, that's what it says these things are. It's a symbol of the rebellious nations that she controls. And her name is Babylon the harlot. And so the vision would have been very clear to that first century listener that John is personifying the military and economic power of the empire that is around him. That empire that says, if you pledge allegiance to us, we will let you live and make you wealthy by oppressing all of your other neighbors around you. And so Babylon is simply just the newest version of the oldest archetype of rebellion against God. First, we have the Tower of Babel. Did you know that word is the same word that is used for Babylon? The Tower of Babylon. And so then we have that archetype of the same thing happening later on when Pharaoh hardens his heart. It's like the Tower of Babel. He is in rebellion against God. The people come out of the Exodus and they create their own Babylon. They say, let's go back to Egypt. It was better there. At least we had some food and water. Hadn't even gone 3 days from the mountain. And they already want to go back again. This is the second time. Then we have real Babylon, who's called Babylon, the city of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, who is in rebellion against God, but who God uses to teach Israel a lesson because their own people, they're collapsing from the inside. Now, but how will the final outcome of Jesus' kingdom turn out? Well, it's going to come just like the prophet said that it would come, right? When they called it the day of the Lord. It will come in the form of 2 sides that are going to line up for battle, a battle that never actually, I would propose, never actually takes place, because Jesus shows up riding on a white horse in chapter 19, proclaiming justice. And then the very next image is not a battlefield where people are dying and Armageddon and all these sorts of things. The next image is him seizing the dragon, him seizing the beasts, and throwing them into the lake of fire to be eternally quarantined, to be kept away from all of creation forever. They are unable to corrupt God's new creation for eternity, which brings us to where we're at today in chapter 21. And John, in this last and final theme here in the book, has a final push that he wants us to understand, a final aspect of the coming of God's kingdom and his rule over the earth in its perfection. His final theme of viewing the kingdom of God from a different viewpoint is the completion of what God has been trying to achieve from the very beginning of the story of Genesis, right? John is freely mixing the literal sky image here with the metaphorical image of the sky, heaven's realm. But when he writes this final vision here, the meanings are more and more intermingled and overlapped, or you might say married, these images are, of heaven and earth. Let me read verse 1 again. Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. John was a minister to the churches to these 7 churches. He was ministering to them. He's writing a letter to them. And what do these churches have as their daily task that is so difficult? Their daily task is to look around them and try and discern the actions of God in this seductively fraudulent commerce and businesses and empires and cities that are all around them. Cities that say, oh, well, if you just oppress your neighbor, you can have a lot of land, right? If you just go and collect these obscenely high taxes, I will give you a cut of them, right? That's Matthew, the tax collector. That's what he did for a living. And so it's difficult for these churches to pick out the works of God out of these blasphemous words of Babylon the harlot that is all around him, of the politics, of the pagan religions that are all around them. And so John's vision of heaven is going to answer the first part of that. It also answers the first part of the Lord's Prayer. How does that go, the first part? Who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The first part of this shows that the devil can no longer defame God. He can no longer do those things. But now his name can be hallowed where? On earth as it is in heaven. That's what we see here. Let's read verse 3. And I heard a loud voice. Well, let me read verse 2. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. And they will be his people. And God himself will be with them, and they will be there and be with them and will be their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things, or the first things, have been done away with. And so heaven is not distant then. Heaven is not distant in space. We can't travel far enough and then finally get there. It's right next to us. Heaven is not distant in time. It's also concurrent with us right now. And so heaven is not what we wait for until this magical rapture time, or heaven is not where we go when we die necessarily, but heaven is barely out of range for our senses. And John is trying to bring this out to us. We are now able to look at the events around us not as a hopeless pit of deception and misery and crying and all those sorts of things, but we can see the events that are around us as we are in those cycles that were talked about, of the 7 seals, of the 7 trumpets, of the 7 bowls. That we see the birth pains of a new creation, that it's happening, it's breaking into the world through Christ and his gospel through us. And we're beckoning, we're begging others to join us, because there's going to be this final new creation that is started in Christ. And it's remaking God's creation to the way it should have been originally in Genesis chapter 1. And that starts now. That doesn't start at some future point. And so if we want to be alert, we want to hear what God is doing, we have to keep our eyes open in the place where he's doing it right now. Creation in heaven and on earth. That is God's workspace. And so it's especially necessary that we listen and be alert, because we often drop earth from the phrase heaven and earth, right? And so the imagery of the new heavens and the new earth is a return to that Eden picture, or what's often called the Edenic union, that union of God and man and God and his people when they dwelled together in simplicity, in love for each other. And so verse 1 also reveals that the sea was no more. Let's talk about that a little bit. We talked about it a little bit in the Bible class, not this time, but last time. The sea has this reference to a realm of chaos. And it's very interesting to me that we often see, that we also see the sea, the ocean, mentioned where? On page 1 of the Bible. And so here we have another contrast, that this chaos that can't support human life, that God had to break open to expose land so that living creatures could live on it, is now done away with. This chaos monster is done away with. Let's look again in Isaiah chapter 57. These are very old ideas that John is bringing up. I know we look at these things and we're confused because we think he's talking so far in the future about these things, but John is using old language to describe the new things, because that's all we can do, right? Is use the language that we have to describe the things that we have trouble seeing. Yeah. Isaiah 57 and verse 20. But the wicked are like a storm-tossed sea, for it cannot be still, and its water churns up mire and muck, and there is no peace for the wicked, says my God. And so to bring peace to the earth, to do away with the beast that came up from the sea, God does away with that image of chaos. In class, we looked at 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 13, and it said that we're looking forward to the new heavens and the new earth. And the meaning of this new world shows why we are so full of anticipation. That verse 3 tells us in Revelation 21, verse 3, tells us that the dwelling place of God is now with humans. That God is living with his people, that this is what we're looking forward to obtaining for ourselves, that God is dwelling with his people again. See, sin on that first few pages of the Bible ripped man out of the paradise and out of the presence of God, because a perfect God cannot live with darkness and evil and sin. But now, through his Son, through Christ, we can have the victory, not because we tried hard enough, not because we slayed enough people with our sword, but because the Lamb killed a bunch of people? No, because he died himself for our benefit. So it's through his victory on the cross, that emblem of shame and torture, that he has come to rule in his kingdom. And it's through that cross that we can now live with him, that we can be purified like the earth is going to be purified and be raised up a new person, a new creature. Ephesians chapter 5, let's look at that real quick. Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 24. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives are to submit to their husbands in everything. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, to make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. He did this to present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or anything like that, but holy and blameless. If you are willing to join Christ, if you're willing to be washed by the water, you can become a member of his church. You can become a member of his body. The image in Galatians, just a few chapters earlier, Galatians chapter 3, the image there is putting on Christ like a piece of clothing, that we can be clothed with Christ. At the same time, though, we can't reverse the time frame of what we're talking about here, right? Because when was Revelation written? Oh, there's some disagreement, but within 50 years is the disagreement. So if we think, if the kingdom of Christ, it says that was established in Acts chapter 2, if the kingdom of Christ was established then, and all who accept that invitation of the Lamb participate in his kingdom, just like John described himself in Revelation chapter 1 as a fellow partaker in the kingdom, then Revelation 21, even though it's portraying this ideal union, or let me back up, I should just say Revelation 21 is portraying the ideal union between Christ and his people. And Revelation 21 is picturing the resurrected church and a new creation in its perfected state. And John is seeing this eternal reward being manifested, being given to the people of God. And so verse 4 says that he's going to wipe away all of their tears from their eyes. And this image is that while they're on earth, these Christians have been suffering. They're full of tears. They're full of pain. They're persecuted. They've been killed. But there will come a great and glorious time when death will no longer exist. There will be no mourning and no crying. Tears, the tears that God is wiping away on these people are those tears that are shed during this heaven and this earth. But there's a new heaven and a new earth where God will comfort his people. Because Christ has been victorious. He has conquered the powers. He has conquered the authorities of the air, the prince of the power of the air. Remember, spirits are in the air. The same word for skies and heaven. That Christ has conquered those things, and now the people of God are able to take their rest. And that same image is there in Isaiah 25, chapter 25, verse 8. I don't have time to read all the references now. I'm trying to cut down on the time because we're running a little long. And so Isaiah talks about this weeping for the destruction of the nation. But then he prophesies of a time of comfort as God is wiping away the tears. And to tell these first century Christians, behold, I'm making all things new, is a message of great encouragement. Christ's kingdom has come, it has been established, and the process of restoration has begun. And the fall of the Jewish nation and the fall of the Roman Empire are necessary steps as the kingdom of the world is replaced by the kingdom of Christ. And we're not fully there yet today even. The rest of verse 5 in chapter 21 continues on that encouraging message. It says, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. God's word is true and can be trusted. And Christ is reigning right now on the throne, and we're looking forward to that promise. that's been guaranteed by God. The creator of this universe has written down and put his guarantee on it, that we can receive these eternal blessings and these rewards for being faithful to him through our grief, through our crying, through our pain, through our suffering and death of being faithful in this life. And you might have noticed that I skipped over two things. The first one being the New Jerusalem. Didn't talk about it too much in this lesson. I'm going to talk about it next week. We're going to split this into two sets, because the rest of chapter 1 after verse 8 is really kind of talking about the day of the Lord and the New Jerusalem and what it's going to look like. And I wanted to split that into next week. But I also sort of skipped over God dwelling with his people. I talked about it a little bit, but a loud voice is heard from the throne, announcing the fulfillment of this basic theme that runs throughout the entire Old Testament, starting all the way back in Leviticus when we have the holiness code about how to be a holy people, right? Leviticus 26, he says, I will put my dwelling, that's the word, Hebrew word for tent, I will put my tent among you, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. This is the same words that we have here in Revelation that are found in Leviticus 26, verses 11 and 12. And so this voice from heaven declares that the dwelling place of God is with his people and that he will live with them. And when John writes that the tabernacle of God is with us, the Gospel of John writes that, right? He's saying that God in his glorious presence has come to dwell with us forever. And he's given us his Spirit to dwell with us. Notice the word people here in verse 3. My translation, actually this is a newer translation, the CSB here says humanity. Look, God's dwelling is with, the literal word in the Greek there is people, but it is plural. Now, people is already a plural because it's plural. But how do you pluralize a plural? Well, you just add an S on the end in English. The peoples. God is with peoples. That doesn't quite make sense, though. And so, what does this mean? It says they will be his peoples. This is a reference to the many different peoples that Christ has redeemed. This is not about bloodline of Israel type of stuff. God has redeemed the world around us. Remember that even Jesus spoke when he said that I have other sheep that are not of this fold, right? He's talking about the Gentiles. He's talking about you and me, unless you're Hebrew. And those other sheep have to become part of this flock, this one flock, right? John chapter 10, verse 16. The good shepherd is going to bring all those into his flock. And so God is going to dwell with us in glory, with the redeemed peoples of all races, of all nationalities. And God himself will be with them, and he will be their God. And it's his presence and the fellowship, that relationship that we have with him of all believers that makes up the main identifying image of the coming age. There's a lot of unknowns, but what we do know is that we will be identified as God's people. And in John's vision now, we have a new earth and a new heaven with God dwelling in it, with his new creation. And this is a very clear reference, if I haven't said it 20 times already, to the biblical narrative of the Garden of Eden. It's an all-new Garden of Eden, essentially, with the paradise of eternal life with God. It's an image of the Old Testament prophetic texts that are echoing all the way back to the first pages of Genesis now, of telling us it's going to be good. It's going to be like he intended it to be. And so in John's account of a garden, humanity wasn't represented by a couple then. John describes seeing all the nations there. You see, this is what the meaning of be fruitful and multiply means. It doesn't mean go and have a bunch of babies. It means build cities. It means build nations and communities. Elizabeth, get in your chair. It means build cities. It means build communities together. And for John, the fulfillment of God's purpose through Jesus is going to result in the restoration of humanity back to being co-rulers with God over this earth. Ready to work with God to take his creation into eternity. So John